Who's up?
That would be me.
Mhm.
So, well, just make sure, just making sure everybody's properly muted. Um, so, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first session of Wednesday. This is all about virtual field trips and online teaching, and so one of the aspects of Institute this year, of course, that might be a little different for you is that we are not in Chad's Ford. And so, because of the virtual institute and sort of the extremely unique nature of teaching and running a planetarium in 2020, we thought it would be a good idea to have a session or two that focused a bit on virtual field trips, online teaching, online content creation, the sorts of things that planetariums are needing to do nowadays to be able to stay relevant and more importantly, stay open and stay funded. So a little bit of what we're going to talk about in this first hour here is just kind of going over what the virtual field trip and online teaching environment looks like right now for planetariums. I've been lucky enough the last couple of months to be working with a lot of different individuals across the country, both Spitz customers and not, and seeing what they're doing in creating this sort of new content and transitioning from field trips and audiences in our domes every day and every week to the point where some of you have not been in your domes since February or March, and we're acutely aware of how disturbing that situation can be to long-term goals and to the visions you have for your domes and so on. So, what we want to do for this the first hour is again go a little bit over some of those basics of how things have been going for the planetarium. We've got all of our proctors in the room; they'll be watching the chat. But because this is a bit more free flowing, and we do want to hear a lot of what people are doing both in this hour and especially in the next session, where we want to just kind of hear from everybody and get your feedback on what's working and what's not working and sort of what are the unique aspects of your own situation. Feel free to digitally raise your hand in the participant window. Feel free to put questions in the chat. And I won't go as far to say unmute and just talk over, but if it's really important and at some point in the next session we need to do so, we'll make sure that happens. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. Got a little PowerPoint just essentially to give us an outline to work from over these next few minutes. And so the big thing, of course, is that starting mid March, almost every planetarium in the world shut down. There was a survey that was put out by the International Planetarium Society. They received 300 responses back, and 298 of those responses indicated that their planetarium had closed. And this was in the span of a week between sort of the opening of the pandemic, sort of the stay-at-home orders across the United States and most of the world. So this is something that's affecting everybody. And of course, we are in a state where some planetariums have begun to reopen. There are some sites that are allowing for audiences to make their way back into the domes. But one of the things that's very important about this group in particular is that we can take side-home customers and put them into a few pretty broad categories. We, for example, and I'll bring the chat back up here. We have a lot of school planetariums, planetariums that are inside of K through 12 or colleges and universities, in which staff is limited. You know, there may be only one of you who's running the dome. If the schools are closed, then the planetarium is likely to be closed with you. Of course, we do have our planetariums at science centers and museums, and all of this together is giving us different environments in which these online field trips, this online teaching plays a major role. Um, So when we're looking at closing down for months on end, there are of course all of the big fears. You know, the hope is of course is that everyone in this room right now is still able to work at their planetarium, is still being is still getting paid, still has a job. We know that that's not necessarily the case for everyone in the field. And so, of course, there are important numbers when we talk about attendance. For some planetariums, attendance is the most important thing. Perhaps if you're a school planetarium, it doesn't matter how much revenue you bring in necessarily, but it does matter how many people get in your seats and see shows every single year. For other planetariums, especially those at science centers and museums, revenue is extremely important. There may be a lot of these institutions where the vast majority of your operating budget is based on through the door revenue. And so if nobody's coming to the museum or your science center, no one's coming to planetarium shows, and you don't have any subsidies, you're in really difficult positions. And so of course, those are the places that are most likely wanting to open sooner so that those revenue streams can resume. But there's also probably a number of you out there who need people in your domes, and you need to be able to access your domes to keep your grants being fulfilled. You know, there are certain aspects of the grant process where you're expected to have a certain level of outcome. And I would hope that many of the grantors are aware of the situation and are willing to give a little bit of leeway to the grantees. But we do know that all of this is going to be extremely important in sort of looking forward in how planetariums are going to reopen, and how different that is going to be, what it means to be a planetarium, what it means to be a staff member at a planetarium in the months and years to come. We also want to look at sort of staffing as a big issue, and it's always good to hear from our customers about this. Is that with furloughs and layoffs and cutbacks, you may have had a crew of 3 or 4 before COVID, and now that crew is down to 1 or 2. Or if you are the single person running your dome, how does all of this affect you where you may not be able to get in the dome as often, or there have been cutbacks in your hours, or you have been, in some cases, your time and hours at your institution have been redirected entirely, where you may still be nominally working at the planetarium, but working elsewhere on campus or at your institution to make up for the fact that you can't have anybody in your institution. So just kind of giving everybody that baseline of what it looks like to be a planetarium. If you're scared about what all of this means, you are certainly not alone. And of course, that's one of the reasons we wanted to even have this discussion in the first place, was to make sure that everyone feels like there is a resource available, uh, so that you're not standing out there all alone wondering if this is only happening to you, or how good or bad things are elsewhere. We are all here to help. And so we're facing a new reality here in this virtual field trip and online teaching world. And that, of course, is divided into two major aspects of how we deliver content. The first is what most of you have either seen online or are doing yourselves. We don't like to broadcast this, but we do like to stalk as many of our planetariums as possible. We like to follow you online and see what you're doing and see what sort of content you're putting up. And in many cases, it is really, really impressive. You were probably hired to run a planetarium. You were not hired to be a streamer. You are not hired to be a videographer. You are not hired to write 3-minute scripts for little planetarium shows that get put on Instagram or Facebook or some other social media. We've had to adapt. One of the things you see now is that every planetarium that's moving towards social content, whether it be the streaming free content or not, is it's showing just how important what we do really is. You can't just push a button and this stuff magically appears. You've got to be pretty good at it. You have to be a good presenter. You have to be a good communicator for these things to work well. And we're seeing it time and time again from our planetariums and from other planetariums throughout the country, that people are rising to the occasion. That the 65-year-old planetarium director who didn't think she would ever be putting a virtual planetarium show together now has lights and a green screen in her house and she's writing scripts. People are rising to the occasion, and that's a really positive thing for all of us. The thing is that in most cases, these are meant for at-home audiences, sort of replacing our public shows or maybe our public outreach. It's star shows or updates on Comet Neowise, or perhaps you have individuals in your area that you have access to. Maybe you do interviews with them, or this is a story about major happenings in the sky. And you're not going to charge anybody to watch this on Facebook, watch this on YouTube or Twitch or Instagram. It is certainly helping many planetariums to increase their digital footprint. We're seeing a lot of places that are adding hundreds, if not thousands, of new followers in certain large metropolitan areas because people are looking for this content. And it's really important to note um, that if you are looking at all of this and feel that as you scroll through your Facebook feed, for example, that there's just too much content out there, that every planetarium seems to be doing virtual content, that somehow that diminishes the need for you to produce content, or probably more specifically, it makes you think that you're not good enough. Maybe you don't compare to the production values of other planetariums. And that is probably the worst lie that you could tell yourself at this point. Like politics, most planetariums are local. And when you produce content for your audiences, the ones that you know better than anyone else, that is going to be the best determiner long term of whether or not this is going to work for you. So if you're the only planetarium in a 2-hour radius of where you are, probably a good idea to make your own content. But if there's a planetarium 30 minutes down the road, they may be just serving a distinctly different audience that you have an opportunity to fill the other niches, the other um, places in this puzzle that may not necessarily get covered. So know your audiences, know that your local work is appreciated. And remember, these are the people who are going to come back to your dome when they're able to, when we get to the point of a vaccine and low transmission rates and that glorious day in the future we're all kind of fingers crossed and hoping for. They will remember what you've done here to serve them at a time when you could, in many cases, just not do anything at all. The planetarium is closed, and that's it. It's a dome and a projector, and that's all it'll ever be. What we're seeing is that the vast majority of places are saying that's not true at all. The planetarium is much, much more than that. But for many planetariums, we are increasingly worried about the sorts of shows that bring in the majority of revenue. If you're a college or university planetarium, if you're a planetarium in the K through 12 system, this is really where the majority of your time and effort is going to be anyway. And that's how do we offer school field trips, the outreach that maybe we do. If you have a portable dome, you know that this is, we're probably 18 months away from anybody being able to use a portable dome that has more than 4 people inside of it. So our reality is very, very stark. We have students that will be going back to school, in some cases in a matter of weeks, and whether or not those children are going back to a brick and mortar school or whether they're going to have these sorts of virtual schools for the foreseeable future, how do we as planetariums serve those needs? What can we do either from home or from our domes to be able to serve them and perhaps more importantly, provide us with some revenue, some attendance numbers, something that we can go and say either we need a grant to help subsidize our operating, or for a school board or a school district to look at a planetarium and go, well, they may not have brought in the revenue this year because of all of these very, very real and explicit reasons, but they are still very much an asset, very much a resource to the education of our children. Um, Really, what we're trying to do here is stay relevant. So, when we're talking about virtual field trips and online teaching, we're trying to focus on how do we make planetariums as indispensable to our communities as possible. And education, educating the children, is probably the number one way of doing that at this point. Um, there will be a couple of discussions about how we charge for these things. There are a number of considerations that have to go into figuring out how charging for a virtual field trip works. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And also, a field trip generally isn't 15 or 20 minutes long. If you have a field trip and they come in and they watch a live interactive show, in all likelihood, this is going to be at least 30 minutes long, if not a little bit longer. Certain groups, you could get them to 45 minutes or even an hour and fill that time with all of the great information, all of the great interactivity that you could ask for. How do we transition that into the digital world? So before we move on to that, any questions, comments, concerns before we keep going? And so I've got both chat and the participants window open. So as hands and questions come up, we can call on those as needed. All right. So virtual field trips and teaching. This is where we get a little bit into the pedagogy of it all. This is where we begin to see some very real changes in how we operate as planetariums. One of the main roles that planetariums have played in the past is that we are perhaps the very, very best location for informal education, the sort of education that happens outside of a classroom, outside of set lesson plans. Of course, when we say set lesson plans, most of us have been dealing with state and national standards for years. And if you're new to this, if you can go through Dr. Bradstreet's curriculum, for example, and take a lot of what he's created and match it very, very closely to state standards or next generation science standard, what you might see as NGSS. Those are the sorts of resources that in our domes are really easy to show to teachers. It's This is what you've been talking about in class. Here's how we can reinforce it. Here are topics that will come up. Here are ones that we can introduce for you. And then occasionally, here are things you cannot teach in your classroom effectively that we can teach extremely well in the planetarium setting. That setting is gone. And so they're not under a dome, they're not in the dark necessarily. We don't get that, let's turn off all the lights and then the star field shows up and they get the oohs and the ahs of seeing a dark sky for perhaps the first time. But we do have an opportunity to rethink how we deliver those sorts of messages and those sorts of experiences uh, by realizing that with this move towards a blurred line between the formal and informal education spheres, that we have a real opportunity as planetariums to jump in and help define what that looks like. So, of course, a number of pros and cons. One of the big pros about staying at home and doing a virtual field trip is that you don't have to pay for busing. We hear this all the time. It's everything that I heard when I was running a planetarium, that it wasn't the admission to the planetarium that was the problem, it was the busing. It was, I've got to pay this amount of money for one child to get on a school bus. And there's certain times that they can't go because the buses are in use for the middle school or the high school. And we don't know if we're ever going to get to the planetarium. For certain schools in more socially and economically depressed areas, it can be an absolute no go. There's no chance that they're going to be able to get this sorts of information, this sort of transportation and the costs, given the already tight budgets, and in many cases the inability of parents to be able to pay the additional money for the field trips. With virtual field trips, it's you turn this on at 10 a.m. and you expect everybody to be there. In some cases, you can have districts that will provide money for busing. You can have grants. I believe a couple of years ago there was a grant from Target, the Target Foundation, specifically for Title One schools, those that receive a certain amount of local and federal funding because of their economic situations, that was to be used specifically for busing. And so if you got one of these grants, you could say, we're going to send this many classes to a uh, off-site campus, off-campus institution, and now you've got the ability to do so. As the presenter, you do have complete control over the online environment. And that's a really powerful thing. We can control what technology we use. We can control whether or not students can use their videos or they can chat with us. We can set it up so that it's fully interactive, and they can access us at all times during the show, or we can make it so that it's completely turned off, that the only people that we ever talk to are the teachers, and they're in charge of facilitating the interactivity with their students. So how we want to create our shows, how we want to create the curriculum, we have the ability to control the environment for that. Essentially the same as what we could do in the dome, still a pro for us that we have mostly complete control over that online environment. Very importantly, though, planetariums have increasingly become the science gateways in communities. It is a place where people can say, it's, the grandparents like, oh, I remember when I was a kid. And especially hearing this in Florida, it's like all the grandparents were from New York. It was, oh, I remember going to the Hayden Planetarium in the 50s. And I remember seeing the sky, or I remember seeing a laser show in the 70s or 80s. They have a planetarium experience to tie to. And the newest generation, we can provide those similar inspiring experiences, so that the planetarium is where you go to learn about space. The planetarium is where you go to learn about science. The planetarium is a safe place to do all of this. And that means we serve our communities in a very unique way. So if we're offering these sorts of online field trips, this virtual teaching, we're building the audience, we're building our connection to the community, we're making ourselves more indispensable. And that, year in and year out, is going to make it far more difficult for a cost cutter to say, well, let's look at the planetarium. They don't seem to be adding anything to our district. They add nothing to the community. And then they look at you and go, well, they're adding a ton to our community. They're doing all of this to, it makes the schools look better. It makes the districts look better. It makes the museums look better when you have something that, even in the midst of the worst pandemic in any of our lifetimes, we're still able to produce content that people can interact with and learn from. So sometimes it can get a little bit daunting. Sometimes it feels really heavy. Remember, we're doing a really, really good thing here, and we're going to continue to do that as we move forward. The cons, though, are pretty clear as well. There are some real challenges to having interaction online, and it's both the way that we structure our planetarium shows now and in the future, and it's also how much control we want to cede back to the teachers and the students. It would be great to have a bunch of sixth graders interact with you face to face and see all of their faces there in the Zoom window. But then again, for all of you who either have sixth graders or have worked with sixth graders, that may be one of the most dangerous things you could possibly do. And so While on the one hand, seeing people laugh and react is great, you also don't want a sixth grader to do something that a sixth grader might think is appropriate, but that everyone else in civilized society doesn't. So again, up to the teachers, the presenter, your the policies of your institution in how that's going to work. And this isn't just a Zoom thing. It's whether you use Skype or Google Meet or Google Teacher or WebEx or whatever. The interactivity problems are still the same. There are, of course, tech issues. Um, we have some real limitations here. You can go flat screen and that doesn't look like the sky. You can go fisheye and the kids are like, why is it a circle? And then you're spending very, very valuable teaching time trying to help them define what it is they're actually looking at. So we've got to make decisions on how that's going to work. If my power goes out right here in the middle of the presentation, then the presentation's done. And I have to wait until the power comes back on, or like Brad gets up and starts soft shoeing or something. But it's not what you paid for. Like it's not what you showed up with. And yes, Christian, adults don't understand that circular sky either. All of our audiences are dealing with the same sort of inability to wrap their head around. It's not a dome and not the real sky. What even am I looking at? So we have to take all of these issues and limitations into account, and not just from our end. It is not every student has access to a laptop or a tablet. Not every neighborhood has access to good internet. There are some of you, we were helping you install your software at home, and you were waiting 12 hours for something to download, not because you're a terrible person with a bad computer. It's you live in an area in which very fast broadband internet is not yet a thing, or it is very, very expensive. Um, Brad would have to put on shoes first. Um, that is a technological limitation. And if we cannot get to all of our students because of their lack of Wi-Fi or internet connectivity, or they don't have the means to actually connect with us, we get to probably the biggest con of all when it comes to this online teaching, is that and not to make too fine of a point about it, but the limitations of our audiences, and usually they're going to be socio and economic, means that virtual field trips, online field trips, are not equitable. They are not the great equalizer across society. If you are in an area with higher property taxes and your schools are all A's or 10s and everybody's got really fast Wi-Fi, it's much easier for you to facilitate these online field trips than if you live in a socially or economically depressed area where maybe 30% of your students don't have consistent access to the internet. And that may be a low end number. So one of the things that's really important in sort of figuring out how we serve the community is knowing what the makeup of the community is. Whether we provide field trips that might be a lot less interactive, they may even be recorded, and to have those be able to be distributed without internet, or that they're sent to the district, or that the district helps you to send that out to the students that are enrolled. All of these things can be taken into effect, and maybe it's not 100% of what you do, but it is a consideration that virtual field trips, online teaching, has some very, very difficult things to take into account. So, really, it's like anything. Know your audience. Know the people that you're serving. Any questions, comments on that before we move on? All right. Wow, Kelly had a lady try to climb the side dome cage. So no matter what, even if you're in the dome, people
I'm
can go
sorry,
crazy.
Michael.
Yes.
What have you seen for distribution means for people for districts that do have a lot of problems with internet connection? Have there been solutions that others have come up with for you know getting content distributed well?
There are certain districts, and I see Paulette's hand up, so I'm going to let her speak to this a little bit more after. But there are some districts that have decided to reappropriate school buses or old vans and place Wi-Fi gear inside of them, and essentially have roving Wi-Fi hotspots that move into neighborhoods that are known to have very, very bad connectivity, or maybe at a city or a regional level, the idea of having sort of complete coverage of Wi-Fi in a given area, and perhaps that there's a level of grant and subsidy that goes into that. So, Paulette, I see your hand. Go on ahead and give us a little bit of an idea of what's going on in Detroit.
Yeah, so the Michigan Science Center is located in Detroit, Michigan. For we have um, one of the poorest school districts in the country here in Detroit, the Detroit Public School Community District. We've been working with the school district the and other donors like DTE, which is our energy company in this area. We've been working with them, and they've been able to distribute laptops to all of the students in the Detroit Public School Community District. They spent a ton of money doing that, but now students that didn't have access to that technology before have that access to technology now. And they're also working with Comcast, which is our local cable provider, to get hotspots free for anyone who can use them at libraries, community centers, exactly what Alicia is putting in the chat right now. We've been working with all of the different public areas around around the city of Detroit to try and get free Wi-Fi for everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, so there are a number of opportunities um, that perhaps aren't happening at your level at the planetarium, but that given how important this is going to be long term, and I think in most cases we're going to see a lot of cities and municipalities uh, put together the sorts of things where we're moving in a sense where there's of course a movement to make broadband internet a public utility. That if you can get electricity and running water, you should be able to have broadband internet. And we may very much be moving toward that realization here in the United States. So, thanks, Paulette, for the info on that, and Alicia for what some of the local areas are doing. And this is great if you do want to get, if you want to get involved in local politics and make a change. This may be one very, very effective way of doing that. You're a teacher, you are trying to help the community, and this is one very, very effective way of making our communities stronger and better. So considering what kind of considerations we have for these virtual field trips, sort of the things that as you are putting together your plans moving forward for field trips, just things to keep in mind. And in many cases, I know that most of you have been thinking about these probably nonstop. On the other hand, it's entirely possible you've maybe overlooked one or two things, and we just want to make sure that we try to compile as many of these in one place as we could. The first real consideration has to do with whether or not you're going to charge admission. That is a decision that is usually made at the institutional level. It's you talking to your bosses and figuring out whether or not they care that you have little or no revenue coming in this year. If revenue is extremely important, then how you charge admission is going to be probably a paramount concern. Do you charge per class? Do you charge per student? If you charge per student, how do you then verify that the correct number of students was counted? Do you set a flat rate for a day and they can pack in as many students into a Zoom session as they want, and then the money goes back to the planetarium? One of the things that I've heard is that, of course, in all public schools, they are required to take account of what's known as FTE, or full-time equivalent students, and that FTE number is known and is public. And so a class could use their FTE number rather than the number of students, and that tends to be um, a little bit easier for the accountants, a little more easy for the bookkeepers, and something that would make it much easier on your end as a planetarium to say, all right, second grade, what's your second grade FTE? And then here's our admission per FTE, and then you're done. No worrying about students, no worrying about whether or not 1 or 2 students dropped and weren't able to make it, or they were sick that day and didn't get on the Zoom. So things to consider when you're looking to charge. There are certain concerns about charging for field trips, and we will probably have, if we've got the time, I'd like probably like Scott Huggins to speak to this just for a bit. Um, Before we get to that, another big one is staffing concerns. If you're the only person working at your planetarium, you're the only person who is going to be giving field trips. And that's an important consideration, because how much time are you able to put into the presentations? How much time are you going to put into production? How much time are you putting into the administration of the dome? We still have things we need to worry about. You still may be writing grants, or if you work at a college or university, I think of somebody like Megan McCullen from Detroit. You may be serving on college committees or teaching classes or having other responsibilities that take you out of the dome pretty consistently. And even if you were to work in a K through 12, for example, you are not the planetarium director for 8 periods a day, but you get 1 period a day to run in the planetarium. How much can you do relative to the staffing concerns? For those of you who might have a team, even if it's 2 people, that of course is going to make things a lot easier. And how you design your shows is going to be entirely based on how many people you have available and how much time you're able to commit to those field trips. You also now have complete control over what you're going to offer. Are you only going to limit certain grade levels? So if you've come up with school shows that are for K through 5, maybe you'll only offer 1, 3, and 5 this year. Perhaps you go through your list and see, well, we get predominantly 3rd and 5th graders, or predominantly 2nd and 4th graders, and those are the ones you're going to offer. Do you offer your full catalog and say, we're going to try to take what we have in the dome, whatever sort of school shows we do, and give that same opportunity in online? Or the crazy part, do you have schools that come to you and ask for custom presentations? Whether or not you can devote the time to putting those presentations together is one thing. But if a site comes to you and says, we'd actually like to combine 2 grades, maybe if it's a private school or if it's a homeschooling group, they will still, homeschooling groups might be the way that you get revenue that you didn't know about before, because they're still home. They're home before the pandemic, they're home after the pandemic, and they can still pay you. So that may be a revenue stream that you have available that you really haven't pursued in the past. Um, we want a show that's the sun and 3 planets and the Milky Way galaxy and astrobiology. Okay, I could probably do that if you subscribe to the Dave Bradstreet view of producing shows. Custom shows are very easy because you take all the sub shows you've made, you put them into ATM4 and the timeline the way you want them, and now you've produced a brand new show. You've taken this part of Full Dome Curriculum, this part of your custom show, and that part of something you created here at Institute, and now you have a custom presentation. So again, a lot of what you're going to be doing in terms of show production, you may want to keep these in the back of your mind as a consideration. And then this is the slightly more contentious part we left for the end, is what you do with the software itself. There are limitations, and this is not just at Spitz, this is across the industry. There are limitations in your user agreement as to whether or not you can use certain software for the purposes of charging admission. And so it's very important to check with them. And I'll have Scott speak to this. There are, of course, open source options. Where it's not a secret that people have been using things like Stellarium as a completely free program for the last couple of months to run their star shows. And then there are, of course, other options available. How you want to move forward with this is up to what your institution wants to do, what you're capable of either learning or presenting with, and then whatever limitations might exist at the software level. So Scott, if you are still in the room,
I am.
If you could speak briefly to the user agreements between not just the preview suite use but the use of your in-dome software?
Yeah, there are two issues that everyone should be aware of. One relates to your Starry Night preview suite, and the other relates to using any shows that you've licensed, or frankly, any of the shows that we've given you free for casting to your customers. With Preview Suite, technically, and I'll preface this by saying we've dropped this requirement. Technically, any offline version of the software that's not installed on your Dome system and used in your Dome, in other words, anything that isn't your Dome system that you show to the public, cannot be used to broadcast or share any shows. So we're actually in violation of Simulation Curriculum's software license by using Preview Suite to broadcast any kind of shows to our customers. We've lifted that temporarily for coronavirus. And I'm not saying it, next week or next month, we're going to call you and say, don't use Preview Suite in any way to demonstrate shows to the public. But at some point, we will get to a point where we say we're beyond COVID-19 and we're renegotiating with Simulation Curriculum. We'll likely be back in a world where there will be restrictions on whether you can use your Preview Suite for anything other than production and training. That was the intent of Preview Suite, is to prepare shows and for you to be able to train at Institute. So just stand by for more word from Spitz in the future. And keep in mind, our partners at Simulation Curriculum are great people. They work very closely with us and they understand our needs. So when we renegotiate agreements in the fall with SimCur, we'll likely go to them and say, hey, we live in a new world and we need to really talk about ways to get our customers to broadcast some kind of content to your audiences. So stand by for news on that. The issue with the pre-rendered shows, a show like Black Holes, Other Side of Infinity, or Super Volcanoes, all of those shows, especially the ones that come from Spitz, are produced in partnership with a lot of other players. There are directors, there are sponsor partners, there are celebrity narrators like Benedict Cumberbatch or Liam Neeson, all of whom have an interest in those shows being used in a very narrow slice of what we do. And we've licensed those shows for your use in planetarium domes from Planetarium Systems. And where those producers and celebrities don't want to see the shows being used is somebody just takes a flat screen version, they put a link on their website, and suddenly a show that one of our director partners gets paid for in a license is just being shown to the whole world for free, right? They want to make sure they control the content. So again, we're technically in an unusual place right now where we're running some of those shows for the public outside of the agreements. And that's why we gave a limited number of shows. It's not because we want to make a lot of money. It's not because we don't want you to have access to shows. It's because our partnerships with those producers and directors and celebrities doesn't allow us to broadcast them in any other way but the Dome. So again, just stand by for word from us when we're beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll probably reach out via the Google group and say, hey, we're at the end of where you can use Dynamic Earth for free or broadcast it to your customers. And that will probably be true going forward. In terms of future licensing and you guys being able to charge your customers for flat screen presentations, we're working on that right now. That will probably be an issue of you licensing the show from us just the way you've been doing it all along, but us coming up with a separate user license for that show for you specifically to cast it to your customers. So basically the moral of the story here is, as COVID-19 ramps down and we start to get into a more normal world and most of your theaters are operating live again, listen to wording from us about what you are and aren't allowed to share with your customers. And we'll be in a different place where licensing will read on whether you do that or not.
Thank you, Scott. Much appreciated. Yeah, simply all we want to do is ensure that that you know as much as possible, as far in advance as possible for this. And so With that, you should be seeing the last slide here for me, and should take us all of the minute and a half we have left here in the session. Simply, what can we do better? And this is for Spitz. This is for planetariums. This is an opportunity for us to uh, see exactly where our audiences are at and how we best serve them. This is really the opportunity to ask. If you've got a Facebook group, you've got a newsletter or an email list, ask them what they'd like. Get in contact with teachers that have worked with you in the past and see what they're envisioning their school year to be like. Maybe you don't contact them now, you give them a month to get settled, but just let them know that you're here, you're willing to work with them, and you're willing to help them as a resource. Additionally, we can continue to leverage all of this technology. Just because we're in a different state of the planetarium doesn't mean that we don't get to teach and inspire. So keep that in mind moving forward. That look for ways to try new things with the tech, whether it is Preview Suite or something that you're completely doing on your own, or just the way that you present or produce. Leverage that for the betterment of our audiences. And the big thing, I think, what we're doing here at Virtual Institute is if you create something and it works really well, let everybody know, distribute that out. I know that for some of you, you may have a lot of Cydomes in your general area within an hour or two, and some of you, it doesn't matter if you're in California or you're in Washington or you're in Florida. You have the ability to distribute these out, and so do be working with the community. We do have the Cydome users group. There's the TLE users group. For those of you who are going to get real excited about TLE tomorrow, utilize those. Let us know what's working. Let us know what isn't, and let us know what we can do as a company to help you. That's why we're here. So we want you to serve your audiences the best way possible, and we know that you want to serve your audiences as well. So anything that we can do to help your life get a little bit easier is going to be near the top of our priority list. So with that in mind, it is 11:51. We're going to try to do a discussion roundtable in the next session, but we also want to make sure that everybody gets a little bit of a break. So if you want to stay here for the roundtable, we are keeping the room open and we'll be starting right about noon. For everyone else that wants to move to Introduction to Starry Night, review and exercises, you're going to be there with Brad and with Steve. So until then, thanks everybody.